The last time anyone saw Dr. Evelyn Reed was on a crisp November evening. The street outside her apartment in Boulder was quiet. Leaves crunching under parked tires, porch lights glowing warm behind curtains. Her car, a silver Toyota sedan, was gone by morning. So was she. No note, no packed bags, no trace. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. Detective Andrew Drew Miller still remembered that night like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Back then, he wasn't a detective, just a rookie with a stiff uniform, a standard-issue notepad, and a dog that never let him down. Buster, his K-9 partner, a young, sharp-nosed Belgian Malinois with too much energy and a sixth sense Drew had, learned to trust over instincts or evidence. The apartment showed no signs of a struggle. The front door was locked. A book lay open on the couch. Evelyn's wallet was still on the counter next to a half-finished bottle of wine and a ceramic mug stained with lipstick. One light was left on in the kitchen, flickering faintly. The strange thing wasn't what was there. It was what was missing. Evelyn's keys, her phone, her laptop, and her car were gone. No friends had heard from her. No one at the university saw her the next day. No recent travel plans. It wasn't like her to vanish. She was a respected botanist at the University of Colorado, focused, admired, driven. Colleagues described her as a rising star in ecological research. Her students adored her. Her disappearance wasn't just troubling, it was unnatural. Drew had arrived with Buster after the detectives had finished their sweep. Most of them looked bored, already writing it off as another burnout who needed space, but not Buster. He stood by the door, unmoving, nose twitching. Drew followed his gaze to the welcome mat. It looked like any other mat, greenish-gray with faded script that read, "Welcome to my jungle." But Buster's nose hovered above it, tail stiff. Then he let out a low, almost imperceptible whine and pawed once at the mat. Drew crouched beside him. He couldn't smell anything himself, but years later he would still remember what the forensics later confirmed. Deep in the fibers, barely traceable, was the scent of bentonite clay and decomposing plant matter. A faint signature of something wet, earthy, and wild. Something that didn't belong in a third-floor apartment. It was the first hint of what would become the biggest case of Drew's career. 3 days later, Evelyn's phone was found shattered along the shoulder of US 36. It looked like it had been flung out of a moving car. There were no fingerprints, no blood. Just a cracked screen and a dead battery. The trail vanished after that. The media had a field day. Brilliant young botanist missing without a trace. Candlelight vigils. Tips from psychics. Theories spiraled. Some thought she ran. Others suspected suicide. A few whispered darker things. But Drew kept circling back to the same name, Ethan Hayes, Evelyn's ex-boyfriend. A real estate developer with expensive suits and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd dated Evelyn for just under a year. The breakup had been amicable, according to him. But friends said Evelyn had become withdrawn in those final months. Drew sat across from Ethan in an interview room painted the color of disappointment. Pale beige flickering light, metal table. Ethan didn't flinch under questions. He had an alibi. A business meeting in Denver with a signed ledger and time-stamped security footage. He talked like a man who had rehearsed every word. But Buster wasn't convinced. The dog sat quietly in the corner of the room, head tilted just slightly. When Ethan described his last dinner with Evelyn, how they'd hugged goodbye and wished each other well, Buster let out a quiet growl. Nothing loud, barely audible, just enough for Drew to glance his way. It wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. Buster had been trained to detect adrenaline spikes, subtle chemical cues, the sweat of a lie. Drew had seen him react that way before. Once with a kid hiding a weapon, another time with a man standing over his dead wife claiming she fell. Ethan noticed it too. For a flicker of a second, he looked at the dog with something close to fear. Then he leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs, that polished smile snapping back into place. Weeks passed, then months. No car, no body, no proof of foul play. Just a woman the world seemed to forget. Except Drew never did. He would often find himself driving past Evelyn's apartment late at night, as if the sidewalk might whisper something new. Buster, now quieter with age but still alert, would sit beside him in the patrol car, ears twitching at shadows. Some cases burn out. This one haunted. Every year on the anniversary of Evelyn's disappearance, Drew opened the case file and stared at the same 3 photographs. The welcome mat, the broken phone, and Ethan Hayes' smug face. Nothing connected. Nothing fit. But his gut and Buster's nose told him one thing. Evelyn didn't vanish on her own. Something terrible had happened, and someone was still hiding the truth. By the second month, the flyers were fading off telephone, poles and bulletin boards. Rain had smudged Evelyn's smiling face. The university quietly replaced her faculty listing with an in memoriam placeholder. And Boulder, like most towns, moved on. Drew Miller didn't, neither did Buster. They kept circling the case even as assignments shifted and the precinct buried the file beneath more recent crimes. There were no new leads, no new statements, just an unresolved ache buried in Drew's gut, and Ethan Hayes. The man hadn't slipped from Drew's radar for a second. Ethan was back to business. He drove a leased Range Rover, flashed tailored suits, and hosted wine and cheese open houses in Boulder's upscale neighborhoods. You'd never guess he was the last person to see a missing woman alive. Officially, his alibi was airtight. The Denver meeting he'd claimed to attend had been verified on paper. But something about him stuck sideways in Drew's memory, like a splinter under the skin. The way Buster had growled, the subtle delay when Drew asked about their breakup, and most of all, the smugness, like he'd already calculated what people could prove and what they couldn't. It was just after Thanksgiving when the next thread unraveled. Drew was driving his usual patrol route, Buster curled in the passenger seat. The dog had grayed around the muzzle, moved slower these days, but his eyes still scanned everything. They passed by Ethan Hayes' real estate office on 28th Street, tucked between a yoga studio and an artisan donut shop. That's when Buster jerked upright and pressed against the passenger window, his ears pulling back, tail stiff. Drew slowed the cruiser. The office lights were off, but a large construction van sat in the corner of the lot. Tan, unmarked, dust-streaked. It looked out of place in Ethan's tidy, glassy kingdom. Buster growled, low and sharp. He hadn't done that in months. Drew parked across the street and sat for a minute. The van wasn't registered to Ethan's name. No decals, no plates visible, but instincts flared, and Buster's reaction wasn't coincidence. The next morning, Drew pulled the traffic cam footage. The van had shown up a few times in the last few weeks, always after hours, parked for long stretches and then gone. He contacted the judge. By Monday, he had a warrant in hand. When the team popped the doors on the van, it smelled like bleach and motor oil. The back was stripped clean, but Buster, even in his older age, immediately headed toward the rear cabin. He paused behind the driver's seat, nose low, then began barking, once, twice, with growing urgency. They lifted the floor panel, a small stain the size of a coin soaked into the plywood, barely visible. It had been scrubbed, treated, nearly erased, but not from Buster. The lab took swabs. It wasn't blood, it was soil. Not just any soil. When the results came back, Drew felt his chest tighten. It was bentonite clay, the same compound from Evelyn's welcome mat. It was found naturally in only a handful of places in the Boulder region, and one of the densest deposits sat beneath the Gross Reservoir, west of town. A lake. Cold, deep, and remote. Drew sat in his cruiser that night with Buster curled beside him and stared up at the stars. The same questions returned, sharper now. Why would Ethan have bentonite clay in a vehicle never used for construction? Why would Buster react like Evelyn had been there? And why was that van sitting in Ethan's parking lot? He ran the registration again. This time, the paper trail ended at a shell company, one that had no employees, no revenue, no listed owner, except for a P.O. box in Denver that, according to records, had been rented by Ethan Hayes' business assistant 6 months ago. They had their first real link. Drew brought Ethan in for questioning again, not as a suspect, not officially, just a conversation. Ethan walked in like a man immune to consequence. Hair styled, Rolex gleaming, attitude condescending. He joked about how the police were wasting time chasing ghost stories. But Buster was in the corner again. Still, watching. When Drew asked about the construction van, Ethan hesitated. It was slight, barely a flicker, but Drew caught it. He repeated the question. Ethan scoffed. Said he rented the van once for a storage haul. Couldn't remember the date, didn't have the receipt. Claimed someone else might have used it. He couldn't say for sure, but he kept looking at Buster, and Buster kept growling. Afterward, Drew didn't sleep much. He filed the new report, updated the case log, and stared at the map of Boulder and its outer trails. There were too many woods, too many lakes, too much time had passed. The department was reluctant to dig deeper. No body, no confession, no DNA. All circumstantial. Drew understood that, but Buster didn't need evidence. He needed the truth, and so did Evelyn. Later that week, Drew drove alone to Gross Reservoir. The winter air stung his skin as he walked the trails. He watched the surface of the water ripple in the fading light. He crouched near the shoreline. The clay felt slick beneath his boots. Somewhere out there, something was buried, and it wouldn't stay hidden forever. Colorado hadn't seen a drought like this in decades. By late summer, Gross Reservoir, nestled high in the mountains west of Boulder, had receded so far that sun-cracked earth now stretched where rippling blue once was. Boat ramps ended in dry air. Water lines on the rocks stood, like scars. Locals came with cameras to photograph the surreal moonscape. But on a cloudless Tuesday morning, it wasn't the drought that drew attention. It was what the drought revealed. A hiker, looking for birds with a pair of binoculars, stumbled on something buried in the lake bed. A curved piece of metal, barely, poking out from a crust of mud. At first glance, it looked like debris. Then she saw the shattered safety glass, a rim of rusted chrome, and the outline of a roof, sunken deep into the dried earth. Within hours, crime scene tape went up. Search and rescue teams brought in ground-penetrating radar. Drones circled overhead. By nightfall, the vehicle was confirmed. A silver Toyota sedan registered to Dr. Evelyn Reed. It had been nearly 7 years since she vanished. Detective Drew Miller stood at the edge of the dried lake, boots sinking into the cracked clay, sweat beading under his collar. He stared at the warped remains of the car as it was hoisted out, the tow cables creaking, silt pouring off the frame like dirty tears. Beside him stood Buster, now graying, his muzzle flecked with white, his movements slower but eyes still sharp. He'd been semi-retired, living mostly at home, chasing squirrels instead of suspects. But when the call came through, Evelyn's car found in the mud, Drew had looked at him and said quietly, "One last time, partner." And Buster had jumped into the truck without hesitation. The car had been hidden perfectly, weighted with rocks. Windows rolled down to let it sink. The area it was found in had once been over 20 feet underwater. No one could have found it, unless the water revealed it first. Inside, it was worse than Drew imagined. The back seats were gone, removed, torn out. In their place, a twisted set of metal loops embedded in the floor, what the forensic team later identified as handcuff anchors. And there was something else, something that made Drew's stomach twist. On the passenger side floor, rusted into the metal and half sunken in the muck, was a single steel handcuff, closed, locked, and attached to it, a long strand of dark brown hair. Drew had seen a lot in his years, but this hit different. It wasn't just a dumped car, it was a crime scene in stasis. The oxygen-poor cold water had preserved more than rust. The interior held fibers, DNA, and scent. Scent that Buster immediately picked up on. As technicians photographed every inch, Buster pulled away from Drew's side and trotted with purpose to the rear of the vehicle. He circled once, then pawed at the trunk. "No body," someone said aloud. "No bones. Maybe she wasn't in the car." But Drew didn't speak. He watched Buster press his nose to the lower bumper, then bark once, short and sharp. Something had happened here. Something final. Forensics teams swarmed the vehicle once it was brought to the evidence warehouse. They drained it, sifted it, documented every millimeter. There were no prints, no signs of Evelyn having driven the car, nothing on the steering wheel, pedals, or gear shift. That's when Drew realized Evelyn never drove that car into the lake. She was a passenger, or a prisoner. The following day, Drew returned to the warehouse with Buster. The dog sniffed his way around the car once more, ignoring everything until he reached the rear wheel well. His tail stiffened. Then he moved toward the small compartment that housed the spare tire. He sniffed again, then began to bark, louder, this time persistent. "Something's in there," Drew said. "Open it." Technicians carefully removed the cover. Inside was a tarp, soaked and moldy, tied with twine. Inside the tarp was a grim bundle, a shovel, a roll of industrial-grade duct tape, leather gloves, and something else. An old burner phone, bloated and corroded, but intact enough to be sent to digital forensics. "You think this was a kit?" one of the techs asked. "To bury a body?" Drew nodded slowly. "It's a kill kit." Over the next 48 hours, the lab worked around the clock. Against all odds, they recovered data from the phone's SIM card. It held one call log, just one, made the night Evelyn disappeared. A single outgoing call placed around 10:42 p.m. The number was unlisted, but traced through burner networks and proxy accounts, it was eventually linked to a front company registered out of Delaware, a holding LLC, shell paperwork. But Drew had seen enough of these in his career to know where to look. He dug deeper. The Delaware address led to another entity, an investment group managed by someone who had no business being anywhere near Evelyn Reed, Ethan Hayes. Evelyn's, the man who smiled through their interviews, who had an airtight alibi, who said she walked away and never looked back. But now, his name was connected to a burner phone that sat at the bottom of a lake, inside a car that had clearly been used to abduct someone. Drew stood in the evidence room, the kill kit laid out on a stainless steel table. He could smell the earth from the shovel, still clinging even after years underwater. Buster sat beside him, panting softly, eyes steady. "We were right," Drew whispered. "All this time, we were right." The truth wasn't lost. It had been waiting, buried in mud underwater, hidden in silence. But it was still there. And now, it was speaking. The sun had barely risen when Drew stepped into the evidence warehouse on the outskirts of Boulder. The air inside was a cold, metallic hush, thick with the scent of rust, plastic tarps, and motor oil. Parked in the middle of the dimly lit hangar was the silver Toyota sedan, its undercarriage still dripping with lake water, its body caked in a crust of dried mud, moss, and time. It had taken nearly a decade, a historic drought, and a random hiker to find it, Evelyn Reed's car. Her ghost had never left Drew. Even as years passed, promotions came, cases piled high and fell away, he couldn't escape the image of the missing botanist with a gentle smile and a life full of promise. Now her car sat right in front of him, like a time capsule cracked open after too long in the dark. He reached out and ran a gloved hand along the driver's side door. The frame groaned softly. It was rusted, warped. But it was real. Buster padded slowly beside him, older now. His dark muzzle was graying, his steps more measured. He no longer sprang upstairs or launched through windows like the young Malinois he once was. But his eyes were still sharp, and his nose remained magic. This would be his final mission. "Let's see what you've still got, partner," Drew murmured, unclipping the leash. Buster didn't need commands anymore. They were beyond that. Inside the car, the forensic team had already made their preliminary sweeps. The front seat was empty, seatbelts still buckled. Mold covered the dashboard like a disease. In the back, remnants of a blanket and broken umbrella. But it was what they'd found in the passenger side footwell that shook everyone. An old metal handcuff partially embedded into the rusted floor mat. Evelyn hadn't driven that car willingly. She'd been a prisoner in it. Drew stepped back and let Buster take the lead. The dog sniffed carefully around the outside first, then inside, nose to seat, along the gear shift, the back seat, the trunk. Nothing. Then Buster stopped. His ears perked. He turned sharply and fixated on the rear panel of the trunk, specifically the recessed compartment where a spare tire would normally be stored. Drew's pulse spiked. The dog whined low, then barked once, then scratched, deliberate trained signal. "Over here," Drew called to the team. "Bring the lights." They removed the panel slowly. Wedged deep inside, wrapped in a faded blue tarp, was a bundle about the size of a gym bag. The air grew heavier. Inside were 3 items: a trenching shovel stained at the blade, a roll of industrial-grade duct tape, and a pair of nitrile gloves, still intact. And nestled between them, half submerged in damp fabric, was a prepaid burner, phone, long dead but still recognizable. Drew exchanged a look with the lead technician. "Get this to digital forensics. Rush it." The phone could be the link they'd been waiting for, if it survived the water damage. 3 days later, the miracle came. The SIM card was intact, and the team recovered fragments of metadata, including the call history, 1 outgoing call. The night Evelyn disappeared, just after 11 p.m. The number was registered to a shell company, Hayes and Monroe Holdings, LLC. An investigation into the LLC revealed it had no employees, no physical office. Just a P.O. box in downtown Denver. But what mattered wasn't the company. It was the man behind it, Ethan Hayes. Buster's low growl all those years ago wasn't just intuition. It was the first warning. Drew stared at the evidence board back at the precinct, now cluttered with printed maps, call logs, property records, and timelines. Something didn't sit right. Why dump Evelyn's car into Gross Reservoir but keep her body somewhere else? He went back through old interview transcripts, rereading Ethan's original statements. One line stuck out, a throwaway detail Ethan had mentioned during their second interview. She was obsessed with that greenhouse, Ethan had said casually. Always dragging me there on weekends. I never liked it. Too many bugs. That greenhouse. It was part of the university's historic botanical garden, a secluded corner filled with rare plant species Evelyn helped restore during her graduate days. It was also the place where Ethan and Evelyn first met. A volunteer event. Spring of 2013. She said it was where everything started. Drew blinked. Where everything started. That's what Ethan's former associate had repeated during interrogation after the burner phone was linked to him. He said he was going to put her back where it all started. Suddenly, it all clicked. Ethan didn't just kill Evelyn. He buried her love, her memory, her very identity, at the place she held dearest. By that evening, Drew had assembled a small team and a new K-9 unit. Buster stayed home this time, retired now, his legacy sealed. They searched the botanical garden with ground-penetrating radar. Hours passed with nothing. Then, near the old greenhouse tucked beyond the eastern slope, they found an irregularity beneath a cracked concrete slab. It was once a floor panel, used for old irrigation lines. The concrete was dug up. The smell hit first, then came the bones. Human remains, partially decomposed but preserved enough for dental ID. Clothing fibers matched Evelyn's missing outfit from that night, buried beneath the place where she first believed she found love. Drew could count on one hand the number of cases that truly shook him. Evelyn Reed's was at the top. After the recovery of Evelyn's submerged car from the bottom of Gross Reservoir, along with the damning evidence in the spare tire compartment, the case burst open in ways no one had anticipated. Between the shovel, caked with lake-bottom mud, and the burner phone linking back to Ethan Hayes' inner circle, the once cold trail was heating up fast. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Ethan was smart. He'd built walls of deniability and plausible alibis. To make charges stick, Drew needed a break, someone willing to flip. And sometimes it wasn't the mastermind who cracked, it was the weak link hiding in plain sight. Drew stood outside a modest gray bungalow on the edge of Arvada, Colorado, a few miles east of Boulder. He wasn't here for Ethan. He was here for Carter Bell, Ethan's longtime business associate listed on the shell company that had owned the burner phone. Bell was the kind of guy who blended in. Middle-aged, balding, always wore khakis with a tucked-in polo like he was heading to a backyard cookout that never happened. But something about him had always nagged at Drew. Bell had a clean record, but his name kept showing up on documents tied to Ethan's more obscure ventures. Carter answered the door like a man who hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted to the badge Drew flashed, then down to Buster, who sat beside Drew's leg. Older now, slower, but still a silent force. "I already talked to the police," Carter said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know anything about that girl." "We know you had the burner phone," Drew said calmly. "We recovered data from the SIM. Last call made the night Evelyn vanished, placed near US 36. Carter didn't respond. Drew leaned in. "We've got your name on the company. We've got the shovel with matching soil. Don't make us guess. Help us understand what happened." Carter glanced at the dog again. Buster didn't move, didn't blink. That's when Carter cracked. His shoulders slumped like a man finally dropping a weight he'd carried too long. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I didn't even touch her." "Then tell me what you did." In the interrogation, room hours later, Carter's confession spilled out in a slow, ragged voice. He said Ethan had called him in a panic, said things had gone wrong. Said he needed help getting rid of a car. That was it. No details, just, "Help me clean up." Carter owed Ethan. He'd borrowed money for a failed project in Arizona. Ethan held the debt over him like a loaded gun. So Carter agreed. They met, late that night outside a closed nursery supply lot. Ethan had already wiped down the car. Evelyn wasn't in it. Carter said he never saw a body. Together, they drove the car out toward Gross Reservoir. Ethan had chosen the spot ahead of time. The drought hadn't yet hit and the water was high. They backed the sedan down a dirt trail near a service road. It was heavy and they had to fight the mud. Carter didn't ask questions. He just helped roll it down the embankment, watched it vanish beneath the black water like a stone swallowed by guilt. "I figured she ran off. Figured Ethan was just covering his tracks," Carter muttered. But then he said something weird. Drew sat forward. "What did he say?" Carter stared at the table. He said, "She's going back to where it all began." Drew didn't sleep that night. That one sentence rattled around in his brain like a loose screw. Where it all began. What did that mean? He pulled out Evelyn's old file, the one he kept in his desk drawer long after the department had closed it as inactive. Her career, her relationships, her volunteer work. It was all there. And then he saw it. A photograph from a university fundraiser taken 6 years earlier. Ethan, Hayes and Evelyn Reed, both smiling, both younger. Behind them stood a large glass greenhouse with a weathered brass plaque, Boulder Historical Botanic Conservatory. Evelyn had been helping restore it back then. She'd spent months cataloging rare plant species in the greenhouse's private collection. It was her favorite project. She had mentioned it several times in recorded lectures and emails. That's where they met. That's where the relationship started. That was the origin point. And maybe where it had ended. The conservatory sat locked behind chain-link fencing on the edge of the university grounds, overgrown and forgotten, the project frozen due to budget cuts. Most people had moved on. Drew hadn't. With a search warrant in hand, he returned to the site the next morning with a K-9 unit and a small forensic team. Buster came too, not because he had to, but because Drew couldn't imagine doing this without him. They navigated the cracked cement paths, glass shards crunching underfoot. Weeds spilled from broken flower beds. The main greenhouse loomed ahead, like a glass tomb, its panels fogged with years of mildew and dust. Drew let the new K-9 team lead. Buster stayed at his side, panting in the morning sun. 20 minutes in, one of the younger dogs alerted, just a soft bark near the east wing. A patch of uneven concrete near an old orchid bench looked recently disturbed. Not fresh, but out of place. The crew brought in a ground-penetrating radar. It pinged hard, then came the jackhammers. 6 inches down, the shovel struck something solid. 12 inches later, they found her. Human remains wrapped in deteriorated fabric, a bracelet still intact. DNA would confirm it soon, but Drew already knew. It was Evelyn, buried beneath the place she had loved most. Later, standing by the excavated hole, Drew looked down at the concrete slab and exhaled, long and slow. Beside him, Buster sat in the grass, head lowered, tail still. After years of silence, Evelyn Reed had finally come home, and now it was time to bring her killer to justice. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens and cameras ready. Evelyn Reed's colleagues from the university sat shoulder to shoulder in the front row. Some had traveled across the country just to be here. On the far right side, Drew Miller stood in full-dress blues. He wasn't here as a detective today. He was here as a man who never gave up on a missing woman, and the dog who helped him find her. Ethan Hayes sat at the defense table, looking thinner, his once polished charm now replaced with a blank stare and sunken cheeks. His lawyer whispered rapidly in his ear, but Ethan didn't respond. Maybe he knew it was over. Maybe he had known since the day Drew pulled Evelyn's car from the bottom of Gross Reservoir. The prosecution laid everything out piece by piece. The surveillance footage of Ethan's construction yard, the bentonite clay on the floor of the truck, the shattered burner phone found inside Evelyn's submerged car. The forensics team had pulled a miracle, salvaging call logs, texts, even GPS pings that traced Ethan's path up to the reservoir, and then back to Boulder the night Evelyn vanished. But it was the confession from his business partner that had torn the case wide open. "I didn't kill her," the man had said in court, "but I helped cover it up. Ethan paid me, told me to get rid of the car, said she left town and wasn't coming back. I believed him, until he said he'd put her back where it all started. That's when I knew." Drew never took his eyes off Ethan during the testimony. He remembered that line like it was etched in stone, back where it all started. Drew had followed those words to the university's botanical gardens, a place Evelyn had poured her heart into. There, under an old greenhouse built for rare ferns, canine officers had unearthed her remains beneath a cracked concrete slab. The scent had long faded, but the soil hadn't lied. The final nail came from the shovel. That rusted tool found in Evelyn's car had still held traces of dirt, a unique blend of bentonite and the rare spores from the exact species Evelyn had helped grow inside that greenhouse. It was irrefutable. The murder weapon, the grave, the connection. The prosecutor's closing statement echoed in the room like thunder. Ethan Hayes didn't just kill a woman. He buried her where her life began, twisting her love for nature into his hiding place. He thought time and water would protect him. But justice has a longer memory. When the verdict came down, guilty, first-degree murder, life without parole, there was no outburst, no cheers, just silence. The kind that wraps around a room like a warm blanket after a storm. Drew exhaled slowly, eyes stinging. Justice wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it looked like a man standing alone in a courtroom, watching a monster finally fall. Later that afternoon, Drew visited Buster. The old Malinois lay on the porch, muzzle graying, eyes half closed, a tennis ball resting between his front paws. He didn't rise when Drew sat beside him, just wagged his tail once and gave a slow blink of recognition. "You did it, buddy," Drew whispered. "We did it." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ribbon, deep blue with a small, brass medallion shaped like a paw. It was nothing fancy, just something the department had made to honor Buster's years of service. Officially, Buster had retired months ago, but in truth, this was his final case, the one that had haunted them both. Drew looped the ribbon gently around Buster's collar. "You brought her home," he said softly. The sun dipped lower in the Colorado sky, casting long shadows across the porch. A breeze stirred the trees. For the first time in years, Drew felt the weight lift off his shoulders. Evelyn's family could visit her grave now, Her story had an ending and justice had a name. Evelyn Reed. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. The Sunken Echo wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about persistence, instinct, and the bond between a detective and his K9 who never stopped searching for the truth. What would you have done if Buster was your partner? Would you trust his nose over a man's word? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. To Animal Heroes for more true stories where courage has 4 legs and a heart of gold.